Ever get that feeling like, you've climbed to the top of the mountain, achieved everything you thought you wanted, but still feel strangely empty?
Yeah.
That's the vibe we're diving into today with Ecclesiastes,
Oh, interesting.
a book written by a king who seemingly had it all, yet grappled with life's biggest questions.
It's almost counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
You'd think a king, especially one known for his wisdom like King Solomon, would be riding victory laps, not wrestling with feelings of futility.
Yeah.
But that's what makes Ecclesiastes so fascinating.
Yeah, it's like we're getting a backstage pass
Right.
to the life of someone who, at least on paper, should be living the dream.
Exactly.
So walk us through this. What's the deal with this book? Why does it start off feeling like one big, life is meaningless sigh?
Well, right off the bat, Ecclesiastes hits us with this recurring word, hebel.
Okay.
Now, most translations render it as meaningless or vanity, but the original Hebrew, it packs more of a punch.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the Hebrew nuance that's getting lost in translation?
Hebel literally translates to vapor or breath.
Huh.
Imagine that. Life, with all its complexities and pursuits, reduced to something as fleeting as, like, a wisp of smoke.
Wow.
No wonder Solomon is feeling a bit disillusioned.
That's such a powerful image, and it really sets the stage for everything that follows.
Mm.
But you've got to wonder, why the heavy sigh, Solomon? You're a king, you've got wealth, wisdom, power. What's with the existential dread?
He actually lays out his reasoning quite clearly, and it's surprisingly relatable, even thousands of years later. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, he points to the cyclical nature of life. Generations come and go, the sun rises and sets, the wind blows in circles. He observes that there's this inherent rhythm to existence that, even as king, he can't escape.
It's like we're all on this merry-go-round of existence.
Yes.
And even if you're king of the carousel, you're still along for the ride.
Exactly. And that realization can be both beautiful and terrifying.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you're part of something much larger than yourself,
Right.
but it also begs the question, what difference does it all make if we ultimately fade away like a breath on the wind?
And Solomon doesn't stop there, does he?
No, he doesn't.
He goes on to test this Hebel theory, exploring if any of the usual suspects, pleasure, success, knowledge, can break the cycle of meaninglessness.
He goes all in, too. Throws himself into lavish parties, ambitious building projects, dives deep into philosophical and intellectual pursuits. The ancient world equivalent of a midlife crisis, but with way more resources at his disposal.
So what's the verdict?
Yeah.
Does he find the secret sauce?
Right.
The antidote to this feeling of Hebel?
Spoiler alert, he doesn't. In chapter 2, he recounts all these experiences and arrives at the same conclusion: it's all chasing after the wind.
Yeah?
Fleeting, temporary, ultimately unsatisfying.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, this might be feeling a little heavy, a little too real, maybe? We're not all ancient kings, but I think most of us can relate to that feeling of, is this all there is?
Yeah.
So how do we make sense of Solomon's experience, his struggle? What's he trying to tell us?
I think what Solomon's grappling with is the tension between our human desire for permanence, for lasting meaning, and the reality that so much of life is transient.
It's like we're wired for significance,
Yes.
but living in a world that constantly reminds us of our limitations.
Exactly. And that tension is where things get really interesting, because it's within that tension, within that seeming paradox, that we start to uncover a different kind of wisdom. A wisdom that embraces the fleeting nature of life while still finding ways to cultivate meaning and joy.
Which, if I'm not mistaken, is where that famous "a time for everything" passage comes into play.
You got it. But before we get there, I think it's important to understand how deeply this feeling of Hebel, of life as vapor, permeates everything in Ecclesiastes. It's not just a starting point, it's the lens through which Solomon views everything else, and that's crucial for understanding the nuances of what he's trying to teach us.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. So before we jump into those iconic verses, let's take a moment to unpack why this feeling of Hebel, of life as vapor, might have resonated so deeply with Solomon, and why it still speaks to us today. What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting to consider the context of Solomon's life. Here he is, a king, right? At the pinnacle of power and prestige.
Yeah.
Yet he still bumps up against this pervasive feeling of Hebel. It makes you wonder if it's almost a human condition.
Right.
This awareness of our own mortality, of time slipping through our fingers.
It's like that saying, there are two things certain in life: death and taxes. And maybe Solomon despite all his riches and accomplishments, is realizing he's not exempt from either.
Exactly. And that's where Ecclesiastes takes a turn.
Okay.
From existential dread to, dare I say, practical wisdom.
Okay.
Because if we accept this premise of Hebel, if we acknowledge the fleeting nature of life, how then do we live?
Okay, so let's dive into that. Does Solomon offer any concrete advice
Mm.
for navigating this vapor-filled existence? Or is it just one big shrug emoji?
Surprisingly, he offers some very specific advice, and
Oh.
it might not be what you'd expect. He doesn't tell us to build bigger monuments, amass more wealth, or chase after fleeting pleasures.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What does he suggest instead?
He encourages us to find joy in the simplest things.
Mhm.
Work, relationships, a good meal with friends. Solomon highlights the importance of savoring these everyday moments. Remember, he's writing this after indulging in every extravagance imaginable, yet he arrives at the conclusion that true satisfaction lies in appreciating what we already have.
It's like that old adage, stop and smell the roses.
Right.
But coming from a guy who probably had entire gardens of roses at his disposal.
Precisely. It speaks to the idea that happiness isn't about external attainment. It's about an internal shift in perspective.
Okay.
In fact, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, he even highlights the importance of finding contentment in work,
Oh, interesting.
even if it seems monotonous or insignificant.
That's a tough one, even for those of us who aren't ancient kings. What's the takeaway there? Just grin and bear it when it comes to work.
Not quite. It's more about finding a sense of purpose in what we do, even if it's not glamorous or world-changing. He reminds us that our labor is a gift, something to be approached with diligence and even a touch of reverence.
It's like finding meaning in the act of creation itself, rather than solely focusing on the end result.
You nailed it. It's about finding joy in the journey, not just the destination. And this brings us to another key piece of advice Solomon offers, the importance of human connection.
Right. Because even kings need friends,
Right.
or at least someone to share a decent charcuterie board with. What does he say about relationships?
He emphasizes the value of companionship, of having someone to share life's burdens with. Remember how we talked about that feeling of Hebel being amplified by the awareness of our own mortality?
Yeah.
Well, Solomon suggests that having strong relationships can help us navigate those existential anxieties.
It's like that saying, joy shared is joy doubled. Sorrow shared is sorrow halved.
Exactly. In Ecclesiastes 4.910, he writes, "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up." He's recognizing that we're not meant to go through life alone,
Right.
that having a support system makes those inevitable time-to-weep moments a little more bearable.
It's almost like he's anticipating that even if we fully embrace those simple joys,
Right,
there will still be moments of grief, loss, and uncertainty.
right.
So having people to lean on is crucial.
And that's where Ecclesiastes goes beyond a simple, life hack manual.
Right.
He acknowledges the full spectrum of human experience.
Yeah.
The good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow.
Which I think is what makes it so timeless.
Right.
Because who among us hasn't felt that mix of emotions, that sense of searching for meaning in a world that can feel both beautiful and brutal?
And perhaps that's the most profound wisdom of all.
Yeah.
The acceptance that life is full of paradoxes, and that our job isn't to solve them, but to find a way to live within them.
Speaking of paradoxes, we've talked a lot about finding joy in the everyday.
Right.
But Solomon also emphasizes the importance of remembering our Creator,
Yes.
which might seem at odds with the whole it's all meaningless vibe.
You're right. That's where things get really interesting. Because even within the context of Hebel, of acknowledging the fleeting nature of life, Solomon suggests there's room for something more, something beyond ourselves.
Okay, so unpack that for us. What does he mean by remembering our Creator, and how does that fit into everything else we've been discussing? So we're talking about finding joy in the everyday, the importance of connection, and now this idea of remembering our Creator. It feels like we're moving beyond just accepting Hebel
Mm-hmm.
and into a whole other realm.
Yeah, it's almost as if Solomon is saying, look, even with all this talk of life's fleeting nature, there's still a bigger picture to consider. It's not about denying the reality of Hebel, but rather putting it in a broader context.
Yeah, I can already hear some of our listeners thinking, wait, is this a religious thing now? But knowing Ecclesiastes, it's probably more nuanced than that.
Oh, absolutely. Solomon wasn't one for, simplistic answers. When he talks about remembering our Creator, it's not necessarily about, subscribing to a specific dogma or performing rituals. It's more about cultivating a sense of awe and humility in the face of something, bigger than ourselves.
Okay, so how does that play out practically?
Yeah.
What does it look like to remember our Creator in the midst of, well, everything?
It's interesting. He actually addresses this most directly in Ecclesiastes 12.1, where he urges us to remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them.
So he's basically saying don't wait until you're old and gray and, wondering where it all went to start thinking about the bigger questions, right?
Exactly. And I think there's a real sense of urgency in that message. It's a call to approach life with a sense of intentionality, to be present, to the wonder and the mystery of it all while we still have the chance.
So it's less about adhering to a specific set of beliefs and more about like cultivating a mindset and awareness that we're part of something larger than ourselves.
That's how I see it. And remember, Solomon is speaking from a place of experience. He's chased after all the things the world tells us will bring happiness, yet he still arrives at this conclusion that there's something more.
He had like all those pursuits, all those achievements,
Yeah.
ultimately left him yearning for something deeper, something that transcended the material world.
Right, and he seems to be suggesting that cultivating a connection with that something more, whatever we understand that to be, is an essential part of living a meaningful life.
And maybe that's where the real freedom lies. Because if we can find that sense of groundedness, that connection to something bigger than ourselves, then the Hebel, the fleeting nature of life, becomes less about fear and more about perspective.
It's a beautiful way to frame it because it's not about ignoring the realities of life, the good, the bad, the beautiful, the heartbreaking. It's about holding all of it with a sense of open-hearted awareness, knowing that even in the midst of impermanence, there's a deeper truth to be found.
And that brings us back to that final verse, doesn't it? The one that ties a neat little bow on this whole whirlwind of a book. Ecclesiastes 12.13-14. Now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil.
After all the questioning, the searching, the grappling with existential angst, it's a powerful statement. And it definitely leaves us with a lot to ponder.
Because what does it mean to fear God in a world that often feels chaotic and random? And how do we keep his commandments when there are so many interpretations of what those commandments even are?
It's a challenge, isn't it? But I don't think Solomon intended for it to be a simplistic answer. It's more of an invitation, I think, to consider the ethical implications of our actions, to recognize that even our smallest choices have ripple effects.
So it's not just about our own personal search for meaning, but also about how we engage with the world around us, how we treat each other, how we contribute to something larger than ourselves.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our lives have meaning, not just because we say so, but because we're part of this interconnected web of existence. And our actions, our choices, have the power to either add to that meaning or detract from it.
And maybe that's a good place to leave it, with that thought lingering in the air. Because ultimately, Ecclesiastes isn't about handing us a prepackaged set of answers. It's about prompting us to ask better questions, to delve into the mystery of our own existence and the world around us.
It's a book that stays with you long after you've finished reading it. And every time you revisit it, you uncover something new, some hidden gem of wisdom that resonates with where you are in your own journey.
It's a reminder that life, with all its complexities and contradictions, is a gift. Even with all the Hebel, all the fleeting moments and inevitable endings, there's still beauty to be found, joy to be experienced, and a sense of meaning to be created. So to our listeners out there, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. You never know what treasures you might uncover along the way.